When I first created MQ, my intention wasn't to just build a game. I wanted to build a world. Through God, all things are possible, so jot that down.
Alright, so for better or for worse, anytime we see a workplace comedy, I think we sort of ask, okay, what are you bringing to the table that The Office didn't? Or why do we need this show? And Mythic Quest, without question, is a unique, fresh contribution to the catalog. It sets itself apart in two broad ways. One, it's rather experimental in how it distributes narrative focus and plays around with genre, and two, it looks at creativity, art, and storytelling head-on as direct themes. In The Office, it didn't really matter that they were a paper company, they could have been an anything company, but Mythic Quest absolutely has to be a video game. Reason being that while, again, The Office maybe has a broad overarching theme of the importance of seemingly mundane everyday life or something like that, that wasn't something that necessarily came up episode by episode. But Mythic Quest has a dramatic intention. It has an ethos that does matter episode by episode. So, Mythic Quest focuses on the production and maintenance of a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, or MMORPG, or MMO, called Mythic Quest. Executive producer David struggles to manage the competing egos of creative director Ian Grimm, lead engineer Poppy Lee, head of monetization Brad, and head writer CW. David also has a young assistant, Joe, and we also meet HR rep Carol, community manager Sue, and two testers who slowly become prominent characters, Rachel and Dana. The plot follows industry-specific challenges like balancing creative integrity with finances, getting approval from popular streamers, and what to do when the game is hacked. But Mythic Quest is also interested in storytelling as a concept, both as it pertains to the content of the game and why people love MMOs, and in the build of each character. Each season of the show has a standalone episode, and they're very well known, such as Season 1's A Dark Quiet Death, which follows the story of a different video game from initial inception to tragic downfall as a corporate washout. These standalone episodes in particular highlight the themes behind Mythic Quest, which, despite some flaws, is clearly at its heart a passionate thought piece about how creativity, imagination, and human relationships function in a for-profit growth model. In his book, The Storytelling Animal: How Stories Make Us Human, Jonathan Gottschall writes, "When you enter an MMORPG, you not only enter a distinct physical and cultural space, you also enter a story space, an intensely meaning-rich environment, a world that seems, in many ways, more worthy of our lives and our deaths. In the virtual world, the myths retain all their power." You might not agree, I don't know if I do, but the idea that role-playing games like Mythic Quest are a core tenet of storytelling, just as the novel or the film or the epic, is a great premise to explore in a TV series. I don't actually know of many people who watch this show, and that's probably partially because Apple doesn't seem to really promote its own content besides Ted Lasso, but I also think the show, both in and of itself and in how it presents itself, suffers from a lack of clear identity. As I'll mention later, Mythic Quest seasons are all really short, and the show definitely has, or is at least trying to have, a real ethos. So it's not really a sitcom, but it isn't quite a dramatic miniseries either. It feels like it wants to be both. I've seen people absolutely loving the humor and thinking it's the funniest show they've ever seen, and I've seen others feel like it's just not funny at all. Obviously, a lot of that is subjective, but I'm somewhere in between. But as a symptom of this uncertain identity, it's hard for me to feel invested in the characters, even though I definitely want to. And that's because they're a bit of a mixture of cartoonish and serious, but not in a particularly organized way. And given that the show, the production company, and the game are all called Mythic Quest, it's a little strange that we don't know much about the content of the game. So I say it matters that MQ produces a video game, but it could be any video game. We could be in space or underwater, whatever, and that's fine, it's fine. But again, it makes it harder to get invested in these characters because we don't know what they're invested in. It's a weird show. I want more people to watch it. I feel like it's underappreciated by audiences, but maybe overappreciated by critics, particularly season 3, which to me started to undermine the show as a whole. So I'll start by looking at the basic structure, particularly of seasons 1 and 2, verse 3, then look at how frustratingly unrealistic season 3 is and why that matters, before turning to supporting characters and, finally, Poppy and Ian. Season 1 kicks off by letting us know exactly who each character is and what their roles are, both in the office, their professional roles, and in the show, their narrative roles. I think the pilot episode of Mythic Quest is actually one of the better pilots I've ever seen. It revolves around nothing but a shovel. The shovel is the one thing Poppy invented herself. Ian senses it's missing something and wants to delay the release of Raven's Banquet, the expansion pack, which stresses David out, but David ultimately caves to Ian. Brad and CW work on a sort of shallow backstory to the shovel so that more people might buy it. Jo, the assistant, is rapidly abandoning David as she sees Ian actually holding the most power in the room. Obviously, more complexity than that unfolds, but these character roles are fundamental to the show. The roles bring humor, and the roles create plot. I'm immediately interested in the conflict surely embodied by Brad's position: how do we turn creativity into profit? Structure-wise, seasons 1 and 2 both had the narrative backbone of a new expansion pack for Mythic Quest. They were also peppered with smaller things that came up here and there, but those were all game-related. Season 1 in particular had a unified plot behind the identity of the Masked Man, a non-playable character in the game whose lack of true identity frustrates the popular streamer Pudi, hurting MQ ratings. The Masked Man gets hacked and starts ruining the game until Ian, as a White Knight character, challenges him to a final duel and wins, revealing the hacker to be Pudi himself. Though Ian and CW had sort of planned on making a White Knight character to be the Masked Man's son.
Like Star Wars.
It is a bit like Star Wars, yeah. I was hoping you wouldn't notice.
By the end of this season, we actually find out that Pudi is in fact Ian's real son. So season 1 has this bit of meta storytelling to it. The game makers talk about the need for a compelling story to the Masked Man, and they incidentally get one. The whole plot about the hacking is really a story about Ian's personal failures, and all of the spin-off subplots, such as Dana becoming a streamer, are all united under that one plot umbrella. Season 2 is relatively similar as Poppy and Ian struggle to create a new expansion. They each develop Hera and Zeus, respectively, and the plot of that expansion pack delivers us the story of the difficulties in their creative partnership. Overall, for the first 2 seasons, the plot foreground was always about the production of Mythic Quest in one way or another. In the background, character development slowly occurred. In other words, workplace plot carried human story. But season 3 is obviously a big change. Ian, Poppy, and Dana are now working at Grimm, developing their own stuff. Brad is just out of prison, CW is dead, Rachel is in school, although she swiftly drops out, and even though characters loiter around offices where they don't work, season 3 really felt like 2 shows sort of smushed together. One being a human story without much plot, the Grimm half, and the other being like a weird sitcom comprising supporting characters only, the MQ half. It feels like a case of lost identity for the show, really forcing human stories without that structural plot from the earlier seasons. But this isn't early 20th century literary modernism, it's just confusing. And these are short seasons. There are around 9 regular episodes per season, and they're each between 20 and 30-ish minutes. So all in all, that's like 4.5 hours per season. Each minute here counts. This isn't a sitcom, even though it sometimes feels like one. We're not really here to kill time because there isn't time to kill. And when you have to be efficient like that, structure is essential. The only game-specific plot for MQ in Season 3 was the big movie project, and that actually could have been really interesting. Community manager Sue flags that die-hard MQ players will hate the movie, and in previous seasons, managing those game players was a huge deal, but her concern actually never comes up. The whole thing, making of the movie, is clearly a big money-making play, but weirdly, the commercialization of imagination doesn't come up once as a theme. We don't hear anything about what the movie plot will actually be. We just get cameo appearances from Joe Manganiello, who apparently is a big Dungeons & Dragons fan, so that's fun, but that's just about it. It's fun. Meanwhile, after Poppy finds out that her game Hera is boring, that's it. Hera is just dropped, and Ian has nothing to do. Why doesn't Ian try to make Hera cool like he could with MQ and that shovel, as we saw in particular? No idea. What does Ian do all day? No idea. And I'll come back to Ian and Poppy, but overall, the Grimm Pop half of this season doesn't follow any logical narrative structure either. So I'm rooting for them, I guess, but I don't really know what I'm rooting for. And we didn't even know MQ was in dire need of an expansion pack until the finale, when it's suddenly the reason for the film being dropped. So from our perspective, it's just a random thing that happens. There's no story there to pull us in until it's already over. This time around, MQ actually could have been a paper company and not much would have changed. Poppy and Ian do end up in different places than they started, but honestly, I'm not sure how and why. Why is Hera boring? Again, why can't Ian fix that? Does Ian believe in the new Playpen project? They ultimately can't get anyone to buy Playpen, or rather, Poppy can't. We don't see Ian even try, even though his whole shtick is selling big ideas to people, but whatever. But why won't anyone buy it? It seems like one buyer wasn't interested because Poppy insulted him earlier, but what about all the others? Is Playpen good or not? It's hard to care when things happen if I don't really know why they're happening. Season 3 does end nicely. Ian and Poppy go back to MQ with Playpen and essentially rescue MQ from its lack of creative additions, and Dana starts her own company with Brad and Joe. I think that's a great ending, but as I'll explain, it's not entirely earned, and it felt more convenient than anything else, but it's definitely a great setup for season 4, so I'm really hoping this sort of non-plot, deconstructed season was a one-off. Looking at fantasy versus reality, one key strength of the premise of Mythic Quest is the inherent contrast between the content of the game and the content of the game makers' lives. That contrast was communicated to us visually in the MQ office with these giant caricatures of game characters looming over the regular people. The very idea that what these people are building is a role-playing game in which you create a character and explore quests and battles and castles, whatever, that idea looms behind every episode as we see ambitious and creative people struggle in their real lives. In season 3, though, there's no real juxtaposition between the realistic world and the fantasy world. In part, that's because we don't see or hear about anything to do with the game, but it's also because season 3 really isn't remotely realistic. There's all sorts of things that just don't make sense. But nothing broke my brain quite like the Grimm Pop office itself. The bright white void of the Grimm Pop office visually decontextualizes every interaction, and in doing so really hinders the flow of humor. So a joke like, wow, Poppy eats junk food, works as background humor to foreground plot action, but as the foreground dialogue thrown into this blank void where it's literally the only thing happening, it doesn't land quite the same. Kind of like how we all know people who are super witty or funny on a daily basis reacting to things, but wouldn't necessarily be good as stand-up comedians constructing jokes out of nothing. Acting within context, reacting to context, placing eccentric characters in regular settings actually gives more latitude for dialogue-based humor and interesting dynamics. And the humor, I think, does suffer this season. Jokes tend to go on for just a few more beats and with a little more focus than they should, and some of the humor just revolves around the idea of being nonsensical. For example, in season 3, Dana asks Poppy what she sees when she looks in the mirror, and Poppy says she doesn't know because she doesn't own one. I know this sounds nitpicky, but what? She owns a Porsche but not a mirror? Do the office bathrooms also not have mirrors? Does her Porsche not have a mirror? Does she just look at a wall when she brushes her teeth? How does she part her hair? And that was it. That was the joke. Haha, Poppy is so silly and quirky, she doesn't have a mirror. But she could have instead said something like, I don't know, I can't picture a mirror, which crucially would have been more believable and also could have been more of an interesting reflection on Poppy versus the vanity of Ian. Poppy also says she's struggling to pay rent. I'm really just overall confused about their financial situation as a company and as individuals. And I know I sound a bit pedantic right now, but the details here do matter. It's obviously fine to have an unrealistic show, but if we the audience don't know what logical limitations these characters are subject to, it's a lot harder to care about what happens. I would normally definitely care that Poppy can pay rent, but I have no idea how that's true when her presumably self-financed company operates from an absolutely enormous, spotless spaceship void. And when you launch your own business, finances are obviously a huge concern, so it was both unrealistic and a weird missed opportunity for plot to treat Poppy's rent like a quick throwaway joke, and to me, that exemplifies the weird, unstructured, and unrealistic writing this season. But to be clear, earlier seasons were over the top in a way, but it was in a way that built up a consistent story world for the show. So, it was never strictly realistic, but it could still feel realistic because all the humor bounced around on a consistent rhythm and followed its own logic. In season 1, we found out just how important Brad's role is when he makes all of the in-game purchases suddenly available for free. And though we don't get any specific numbers from the MQ ledger, we know the general limitations of the company enough to care about the revenue that, for example, Pudi Shoe's ratings bring in. Without being able to discern what kind of reality we're living in season 3, I felt sort of pushed away from the characters. And something weird happens with the characters themselves too. So the phrase flat character gets thrown around a lot, but super quickly, the idea was first coined by E.M. Forster in aspects of the novel, and while flat sounds like an insult, it doesn't necessarily mean the character is boring or even super simple, just that they don't change over time. Round characters are necessarily multidimensional and complex, and they're able to surprise us in convincing ways. They change and develop in accordance to their narrative paths. And as part of this lost identity problem, I think Mythic Quest hasn't really decided which characters matter narratively and which ones don't. So there's this blurring of round and flat, and a weird distribution of narrative emphasis. Overall, Mythic Quest is a very decentralized show. On any given week, we might get an episode honing in on CW or Dana or Sue or whoever. And again, to compare it to The Office would have episodes like Phyllis's wedding, and that's the topical focus, but the narrative focus of that episode is still on Michael, Pam, and Jim. So Phyllis gets her chance to shine a bit, but as an audience, we're still grounded in the usual narrative framework. Mythic Quest is very different. If the episode is topically about someone, it's narratively about them too. And maybe that's because, in actuality, many of the actors get time in the writer's room, or even directing an episode, and that's pretty cool. In season 1, Ian and Poppy as characters hold so much concentrated power that it's a source of conflict throughout the whole season. In general, there's a significant divide between subordinates and executives in a very intentional way.
Workers are grist for the mill!
And I love the idea behind spreading out narrative focus so that the show doesn't come off like the actual workplace, but the risk there is that viewers might subconsciously check out of the main story. There's a reason why convention is to have a clearer distinction between round and flat characters.
Jesus, skipped a story.
The story is everything, you Neanderthal.
I think the most successful flat character in Mythic Quest might be CW, and maybe that's because he ducked out before season 3. To be clear, I didn't really like him or particularly enjoy his screen presence or humor, but he fulfilled his function perfectly scene by scene. His special episode Backstory showed us where he came from, revealed that he was a one-hit wonder whose one hit was actually written by Isaac Asimov. We see how he ended up alone, and pretty much how much of a jerk he was, even if, like Poppy and Ian, he was driven by an unhinged dream. And that was a great episode. While it contextualized CW for us, the essence of the character didn't change over time. He does reconcile with his nemesis, but all in all, CW is the same person from episode 1 to his last appearance. There might actually be a solid video game comparison here. You can play MQ like Rachel does, skipping over the story cuts and the game won't change, but watching that backstory will enhance your involvement. And you can skip over the CW backstory episode and you won't be lost or confused. But his absence in season 3 is definitely noteworthy. Without the writer, the concept of writing doesn't come up anymore at all. Seasons 1 and 2 explored the hero's journey, the hero with 1,000 faces, the very concept of backstory, how stories inspire and shape our lives. CW, as a youth, believes in video games as living and breathing stories comprising both authorial and player input at once, an enormous web of potential storylines. And honestly, as someone who doesn't know anything about video games, I really appreciated this insight. This flat character brought a huge, compelling concept to the show's table. And I can't say his death made me emotional or anything, but I did miss his presence in Season 3, where none of those concepts are really explored.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell the girls what you do?
Sure. I live only to serve a man, and that man is David.
Okay, it's normally not.
Next up is Jo. People love her and people hate her, but to me, she's a pitch-perfect parody of a certain attitude that worships stereotypical masculinity and power. But that parody only works if she's kept in small doses as a supporting, flat character. Her obsession with power isn't just a one-hit joke now and then, it actually fuels other dynamics as we see David struggle for authority and Ian radiate charisma.
And get me a coffee, please. Decaf. Non-dairy milk. Please.
Can I get a coffee?
I'm coming, Ian!
And for 2 seasons, most of her one-liners were pretty good. But it seems like in Season 3, they decided to round this character out. And initially, I admit, I was excited. I like her, and you can absolutely grab a flat supporting character and make them more dynamic. I mean, it's not really until book 5 or 6 that Dumbledore rounds out in Harry Potter, but if you're gonna do it, do it. Jo is actually given 2 potential narrative paths in Season 3, and neither really work or go anywhere. In one, she realizes she doesn't have friends or much of a life outside of work. Granted, we then see her thriving at the shooting range, which is her community, and she does have friends, but whatever. And in another, she really steps into her role as David's assistant and goes the extra mile to help him discover his own authority. But why? I was sitting there trying to figure this character out, and I thought, okay, maybe it's that going to brunch with the gals made her realize her obsession with power was getting in the way of having friends and fun, so she discovers the power of empathy and decides to support David, but honestly, I think I just made that up. In the finale, she teams up with Brad to join Dana's company because she's, quote, drawn to power. We also get this idea that despite some dialogue in prior seasons, she actually was bullied when she was younger, and she doesn't know how to socialize. And if they wanted, they could have forged that into a narrative connection to David, but they didn't. So when in the finale, she walks into David's office and makes him fire her so he can look impressive, I still don't know why. She wasn't planning on joining Dana. She didn't even know Dana was happening. So why? And because she is this parody of a character, it's kind of jarring to see her act like a normal human 1 minute and then like a cartoon the next. They didn't flesh out her development enough to show transformation or make her into a round character, but they brought a weird narrative complexity to her that seemingly just came and went.
Dana, we're selling naming rights to the Coliseum for $1 million. Just say whatever you want about it on the stream. Doesn't matter. Some idiot's gonna buy it and call it King Shit's Fucktown.
Turning now to Brad. Brad, as head of monetization, was a flat character. Again, not in a bad way. He had plenty of personality, and obviously with Danny Pudi, plenty of charisma. But we didn't have to unpack the essence of the character. He functioned perfectly as a comedic supporting character with occasional glimpses into his greater life. Sometimes he seems to enjoy manipulating people just for entertainment, but mostly he's a voice of rationality amongst the MQ circus. Like CW as writer and Jo as assistant, Brad as monetization brought a necessary ingredient to the show. First of all, as a unique angle in conversations, but also as a thematic concern. There's an entire episode where, after being insulted by Poppy, Brad makes the 4 purchase items in the game totally free, and the absolute havoc that causes shows just how important monetization is to the game.
Sociopath. But the money that he brings in makes the whole game actually run. You get that, right?
There was nothing mysterious or confusing about this character until Season 3. I don't really know what he wants this season, and as a flat character in the past, I didn't even feel the need to ask what he wants. But we get a full story of what he was like in prison, and then he's mysteriously returned as a suspicious janitor. He seems to have some big secret plan. And again, if that's the case, fine. But when he achieves the very simplest version of what that plan possibly could have been, he's like, meh, I don't know, this is boring. So what were you doing this whole time? Honestly, as much as I would have missed him, I think it would have been great if he just wasn't in this season until Dana decided to form her own company. He could have been a big surprise return in the finale to work for her. Or else have him actually have a plan that he cares about. Ultimately, it's just plot convenience that he randomly decides he doesn't want to work at MQ. All in all, it seems like they pushed a flat character into a round character's plotline, all while making the character less interesting. And I hate to say it, but he didn't really add anything in season 3.
I stayed up all night, and I built this. What do you think?
Finally, there's Dana. Dana is so close to being the hero of the show. They even hint at it in the Everlight episode when Ian identifies her as the ultimate underdog. And for 2 seasons, I think she works perfectly. And it's actually pretty clear that they're going to slowly build out a round character. The second Dana says that even after a full day of playing MQ for work, she goes home and plays MQ for fun, we gotta know this character is going somewhere. Passion for the game is the driving force behind the heroes of this show, even though we're not entirely sure why. But that's fine. In season 2, she and Rachel develop Grouchy Goat, and Dana's ideas are all pretty bad, but that's intentional, and her programming is pretty bad, but that's intentional. The point is, she is absolutely relentless in trying to make it happen anyway, and that's why Ian and Poppy decide to support her. Season 3 really tries to force the gag that Dana is a mini Ian, and that could have been good. Dana and Ian do each follow their own creative rhythm in a similar way, but that's effective because they have different personalities. Dana in seasons 1 and 2 was a lovable underdog with great promise, but then they hit fast forward and sort of collapsed Ian and Michelle into an invincible character. I'm glad Dana starts refusing to deal with Ian and Poppy's shit, but she just yells at Poppy in front of a buyer and tells Poppy she doesn't like her. And it's kinda hard to latch onto this character when she's not subject to any relatable parameters. We don't really know what it is exactly that Dana wants, and we actually haven't been part of her growth. The character needs to earn her triumph this season, and by that I don't mean she needed to work harder, but that we should be involved in how she overcomes her obstacles. I like this character a lot, but because they've skipped over compelling parts of her journey and because characters aren't subject to much logic this season, the stakes are pretty much vanquished. So all in all, I guess it's pretty predictable that if you take the 2 main characters along with the slow burn hero character out of MQ, everyone left behind at MQ is gonna be a weird mess. I love Carol, but she was all over the place this season.
There is no Carol in HR.
Sue was just a cameo. They introduced 2 new testers who are swiftly fired and replaced. David seems like he's stepping into more authority, but he's ultimately just reacting to other people. Phil has an entire episode named after him and then basically disappears. A recurring theme this season is that people have nothing to do. But instead of choosing 1 or 2 flat characters to bring to the foreground or involving the MQ plot more broadly with the Grimm pop story, the show seemingly randomly hands out narrative focus, and consequently, we're missing both build-up and satisfying payoff for all these characters. I don't know where half of them are most of the time. But turning now to the most consistent heart of the show, the 2 most obviously round characters that do keep us grounded, Ian and Poppy. So here we have Mythic Quest's will they, won't they, but as the showrunners have said themselves, there is absolutely nothing romantic here and there never will be. The will they, won't they is about whether or not Poppy and Ian can get over their issues and work together. And by putting their working dynamic at the center of season 3, Mythic Quest is definitely reaffirming that we should be looking at these 2 as one entity. And that's always been a key to the show. While in the pilot episode, the characters are watching for Raven's Banquet reviews, what we're watching for is whether Ian will give Poppy credit where credit is due. And he does. It's a good scene, and it's also a preview of what every season is going to look like. Season 1, Poppy and Ian have their arguments, but it ends with Ian naming Poppy co-creative director. Season 2, Poppy and Ian have their arguments, but it ends with Ian pitching that they leave MQ to make her game. Season 3, Poppy and Ian have their arguments, but it ends with Ian apologizing and supporting Poppy. In season 3, the conflict is pretty much exactly the same as in season 1, episode 1. It's just stripped of a proxy plot about an actual game and is instead thrown front and center in the white void. So how does that hold up? Well, they certainly could be an amazing duo, but the show requires us to get way more emotionally invested in these characters than we actually can. The season 3 standalone backstory episode Sorian was pretty good. I loved watching those two weirdos find each other. But by making that episode, Mythic Quest sort of revealed its own hand. Without it, they haven't fleshed out these characters enough. So Ian is obviously the big pie-in-the-sky dreamer. It's right there in his name, obviously a shout out to the fairy tale writing brothers Grimm, and in how he chooses to pronounce his name as an homage to his mother and rejection of his father. Rob McElhenney is obviously perfect for the role. He carries himself with this obnoxious energy, but he's not quite what he seems. Even if he's bad at managing them, Ian has always been well aware of his own shortcomings, and as we see in episode 1, he cares about his work arguably more than he cares about himself. His obsession with the shovel in the pilot seems annoying and cocky, but my favorite moment of the episode is way late at night, everyone but Poppy is gone, and she sees Ian sitting alone at his desk staring at the shovel. It's a cool parallel to the season 3 finale where Ian watches Poppy, and we learn that he's not just on some obnoxious ego trip for the hell of it, and his instincts are so good, so reliable, that when Ian says the shovel is missing something, it really means something. But then in season 3, his instincts are a random punchline. Grimpop gets a huge buying offer and Ian says his gut is saying no, he doesn't know why, it just is, just like with the shovel. And then after Poppy follows and declines the offer, he's like, yeah, my gut feeling changed and we should have taken that. So in season 1, Ian's instincts had narrative meaning that gave us a reason to believe in him and trust him even when he's being a jerk. But imagine how dumb it would be if at the end of that pilot episode, Ian was like, no, my gut changed, the shovel is fine. How meaningless, how random, and random sort of sums up Ian in season 3. He's really absent this season, and I think that's supposed to be the point, as he's not actually excited by working on Poppy's game, but that's something Poppy tells us. It's not something that we slowly understood ourselves. We've seen plenty of characters like Ian before, big ego jock boy with an abusive father and secret vulnerabilities, but that's okay, it works well here. But that character archetype should have been the basis for launching something unique, and over 3 seasons, we don't really have a broad arc for Ian that wasn't already encapsulated in that pilot episode. And Poppy is a similar story. Even though she seemed like a relatable underdog or the voice of reason, she's not. She's a bit of a tyrant and is just as selfish, if not more so, than Ian, and that's great. We don't need any more stories about big personality men being brought down to earth by sensible women. Poppy is super flawed. She's bad with people, although there's a weird episode in season 2 where the end reveal is that she's intentionally letting people underestimate her so that she can get what she wants.
She inspired us.
No, she didn't. She emotionally manipulated us.
What's the difference?
But that just goes away, which is annoying because it could have been really interesting in the long run, a great contrast to Ian's leadership style. Instead, in season 3, she's utterly cartoonish, and when she snaps and yells at someone, it's not impactful because that's just her permanent state. Acts chaotic, eats candy, yells lots. And we know this actress can do more, we see it in glimpses. But we don't actually know Poppy that well, and I sorta doubt the show does either. Poppy is a fan favorite, maybe partially because she's a hot mess, but also because she's almost the show's protagonist, so we should know her well. A lot of the show is cast through her lens, but the show doesn't commit to her as the singular lead, there is none. So there's not a lot of intimacy between us and Poppy's inner self. We know she wants to engineer a game where you don't play in someone else's world, you build your own. An obvious but effective metaphor for how she's usually building Ian's vision, and how she wants to be independent but can't seem to shake her need for Ian's validation. That's an interesting conflict, but think about it, we've spent 3 seasons with this almost protagonist, and this is really the only thing we know about her inner character. And we still don't really know why. As Ian points out multiple times, the only person that thinks Ian is better than Poppy is Poppy herself. But again, that's the same dynamic that we saw in the pilot episode. And look, don't get me wrong, I love to root for these two. The show does a great job of previewing what it's like when they're in sync, to show how they can hype each other up and build worlds together. We see just enough to know what we want without actually getting it. And these actors have incredible chemistry. But their strongest moments are more like random vignettes. when they figure the shovel out, when Ian overhears Poppy losing her job offer, when Poppy goes too far and insults Ian as a father, when they defeat Brad in Everlight, and my favorite, when Ian notices Poppy hasn't been showing her face on Zoom during quarantine and just shows up at her house.
Everybody else seems to have somebody, but I don't. I'm just alone.
Open your door.
Why?
Hi.
Hi.
The writers on this show can write. These characters can work. But if you string all those vignettes in order, they don't really form one overarching narrative journey for these two. It's just the same conflict over and over in different contexts. In one of the first episodes of season 3, they argue over which role is more important, the big thinker who can inspire worlds, or the detail-oriented engineer who literally creates them. That sounds cool. And then in the finale, the big cathartic punch is Ian saying that he can see it but not build it, and she can build it but not see it, so they need each other. Okay, sounds good, but we already know that. You already told us. We've been here before, so it doesn't feel cathartic. Interestingly, my problem here isn't that the scenes feel redundant. I'm not bored. I love watching these two. I am missing some catharsis, but the real problem is that I don't feel connected to or invested in their relationship, even though I do try. The moment when Ian sees Poppy working alone and remembers all of their beautiful moments together, from the first time they met to writing ideas on napkins, is normally the type of thing that would make me cry. But because they've already been explicit about their conflict for 3 seasons now, it didn't have the gut punch effect that it could have. Season 3 could have shown them working well together on the surface, with quiet tension slowly building until it snapped, and then Ian could realize how much he truly needs her. But again, right off the bat this season, Poppy is yelling at Ian that he's a bad partner.
You know what? You are a terrible partner. And from now on, if I want something done, I'm just gonna do it myself.
So there is a great story somewhere here. These can be amazing characters. But to me, it comes down to the show's persistent lack of narrative structure. There is so much to appreciate about Mythic Quest. All of the characters are morally gray, and of course they are. Millions of people are spending money to hang out in their imaginations. The show parodies right-wing attitudes and left-wing attitudes. It reflects a huge range of perspectives on passion, leadership, and art, and you can tell it's a personally significant project for Rob McElhenney. The entire thing functions at the junction between commercial technology and medieval myth. It's interesting. It's inherently interesting. The show has a strong build. Even literally, every choice about the MQ office layout is a storytelling one. And these writers clearly know storytelling well. Mythic Quest is getting an 8-episode spin-off series called Mere Mortals, which will explore the lives of employees, players, and fans who are impacted by the game. And it feels like that's what this show would rather be, a series of one-act plays connected by one video game with endless possibilities, which sounds cool. But Mythic Quest itself is also a character story, a workplace comedy, a confusing but refreshing jumble of storytelling methods and moods. And I'm most curious to see if Mythic Quest will end on a cynical note or an optimistic one. The special episode, A Dark Quiet Death, might truly be a standalone, but it could also be our key to knowing where this series is going. In the episode, the unique, morbid game DQD is slowly transformed to an unrecognizable antithesis of itself, proving, as the original game maintained, that you can't defeat Doom, you can only avoid it for as long as possible. So maybe that's where we're headed, but I have no idea. For a show that often topically centers the power of myth and story cycles, as I've continuously said, there is no ostensible structure to its own story. But overall, the main reason I'm feeling a little detached from it is that I want more. I want more about the game itself. I want more about Poppy and Ian's growth. I want more episodic drama about the industry. I want more episodes or longer ones. And it doesn't need to be hyper-formulaic to have impact, but I want to feel involved in at least somewhat structured narratives so that when it ends, whether it's this season or years down the line, it can stay with me. Also, this attempt at an internet meme reference was painful.
I see you. You see me?
No, I mean, yeah, sure, but you're a panda.
TV is shit. It's for morons.